Alright guys, so today I'm going to do something slightly different than what I normally do. I am going to respond to a short section of a response video. The YouTube channel Vice Rhino, really great channel, has a lot of interesting science, counter-apologism, counter-creationism content. Published a video last week, I believe it was, about a Dawa apologist and his arguments for creation, and one of these sections contained information about ants in the different worker castes. So I am simply going through this section and adding a little bit of information that pertains to the ant-specific information,
with mountains of evidence backing it up.
What's even more interesting is that some creatures evolve simultaneously. Let's look at some examples. Woodland ants warriors are necessary for the survival of workers, which are necessary for the queen and warriors. So which of them was evolved first?
Well, you kind of answered that question when you were setting up this section. Remember when you said they evolved simultaneously? That's the answer.
Alright, so it's important to note here that not all ant species have these different castes, or polymorphism as it's more formally known as. In fact, the ants that are all around here, basically everybody is a worker or a reproductive. You have some castes in areas where the environment is harsh, or where there are a lot of potential predators, competitors, and what have you. Or if it's a species that forms a very large colony, such as your leafcutter ants, army ants, and things of that nature. The ant caste system is a little bit more complicated than just there are ants that are different sizes and shapes. These ants are actually all members of the same species within the colony, and they're all very closely related to one another. It's just that some have developed to appear different than the others, and they have different physiologies and different abilities which are going to help that colony function.
The exact method that led to the development of all the different castes of ants remains relatively poorly
Alright, let's just quickly correct a couple of things here. Not to be too nitpicky. Larva isn't really a caste, it's more of a life cycle stage. Every ant has to go through the complete metamorphosis, where they have egg, larva, pupa, adult. Not really a caste, it doesn't really do anything for the colony other than ensure another generation. I like the different captions underneath all of these. Sex slave, basically useless. That's kind of true. Queen ant, yep. Technically, these are all workers. The other thing is that these aren't all seen in every species of ant. You know, repletes are mostly with your honeypot ants. It's not seen in your leafcutter ants, for example, or your carpenter ants or anything like that. Termites probably would have been a better system to look at for this, but that's a whole different, more complicated setup. But castes are a little bit more formalized than this.
Understood, but one thing is certain. They have developed multiple times independently. Fossil evidence suggests that ants started their divergence from the other Hymenoptera after the development of the queen and worker castes, so the common ancestor to all ants already had that distinction.
So ants are a weird group of the Hymenoptera because every ant species that we know of is in the same family, which is Formicidae. The Formicidae is a family derived most likely from wasps in the Vespoidia, which we're going to get into in just a moment. There are a whole bunch of different species of ants. We have described about 13,000, but there are almost certainly more than that. Very distinctive features of ants are, A, their antennae. So insect antennae are normally made up of multiple segments, and they have an antennal segment that's very long, and then they have an antennal segment that's very short, and the result of that is an elbow or bend in the antenna, as well as the propodium, which we're going to get into, having at least one knob or node to it. All species of ants are known to be eusocial, which we're going to get into. very few other Hymenopteran families are completely eusocial. So the Hymenoptera is the third largest order of insects that we have described. Our big four insect orders are the Coleoptera, which are the beetles, which have millions of species. Then the Lepidoptera, which have almost 200,000 species. The Hymenoptera, which have between 150 and 170,000 species described. And then the Diptera, which have about 130 to 150 described species. Now, I bet you're wondering, what the hell do you mean by between 120,000 and 130,000 described species? How is there such a difference? Well, when we describe insect species, there are different authorities, different people who decide what constitutes a species. And so some authorities lump a whole bunch of things together in terms of everything has a different species, and some people lump everything together. Some people lump everything together, where you have one species with dozens of subspecies, and other people take a whole genus and split it into different genera with different species. Sometimes you have large genera like Drosophila that have subgenera and hundreds of species. Sometimes you have very small genera of one or two species, but the genera are all within the same subfamily and even tribe because they're very similar to one another. We're just starting to get a handle on how exactly to classify these things. But anyway, the Hymenoptera is a very large order of insects. It contains a lot of different things, from your sawflies all the way to your wasps, bees, ants, and whatnot. So, a couple of things that are unique among the, well, not unique among insects, but very distinguishing for the Hymenoptera. They're holometabolists, which means that they have a egg, larva, pupa, and adult stage. It's complete metamorphosis, and they have a haplodiplo sex determination system, where the males are haploid and the females are diploid. This is going to be important for Sociality, which we're going to get into very shortly, but basically, males only have one set of chromosomes, females have two sets of chromosomes. In most species, the male is produced from an unfertilized egg, and fun fact, some parasitic species of Hymenoptera will lay male eggs in smaller hosts because the males don't need as much material to mature than the daughters would. And so somehow the parasitic wasp knows whether to produce a male or female given the resource availability. So this is a huge phylogenetic tree of the Hymenoptera. Now, sawflies and wasps are what we're going to consider our two major groups of Hymenoptera. The bees and ants are technically types of wasps, so I'm going to call them wasps just for the sake of this demonstration here. You have a bunch of different basal groups of Hymenopterans here. These are all of our sawflies. So at this node on our phylogenetic tree, we have the common ancestor between sawflies and wasps. This is the common ancestor, well, this is an outgroup, and then we have a common ancestor for all Hymenoptera. Then we have a common ancestor for this particular superfamily and everything else. And so when we get here, the last common ancestor between our sawfly group and everything else, which are the wasps, is displayed. Now, I don't know exactly what physiologically or morphologically determines this split-off point, but that's not important. So, the best way to determine if you have a wasp or sawfly is to consider their development and their morphology. So, we have two major Hymenopteran suborders. We have Symphyta and Apocrita. Now, Symphyta has all the sawflies, and Apocrita has everything else. And Symphyta, they have a broad waist because the abdomen and thorax are separate body parts, and in the Apocrita, your first abdominal segment is fused to the thorax. So this is actually the first abdominal segment, not this. And the result of that is kind of a thin waist, if you will, which is why it's said that things that aren't sawflies have a thin waist. Now, the thorax is the only part of the insect that really contains appendages. So if you see in these skin and electron micrographs, this section doesn't have a leg attached to it. There are 3 sets of legs on the 3 thoracic segments, the prothorax, metathorax, and mesothorax. The mesothorax is the final section of the thorax, and that has the final pair of legs attached to it. So you can see here, this piece of the thorax doesn't have a leg attached to it, so it's actually the first abdominal segment. The first abdominal segment is called the propodium, and it flattens itself against the back of the thorax. So you can see that very distinctly in this picture of a bee. And side note, a lot of people will use the propodium to determine what family of Hymenoptera they're looking at. So sociality is a concept in animal behavior and development, where you have a continuum from very solitary animals, rhinoceroses, for example. Most hymenopterans are solitary. Then you have things that are communal. And the difference between something being communal and something being social is communal, they tolerate one another, but they don't help one another out. A lot of bees that nest in the ground are communal. They have a few areas where dozens of females, related or otherwise, will nest in the same generalized area, but everybody has their own nest, and everybody only worries about their nest. They don't take care of each other's nests. They just kind of group together. And why would they do this? A few reasons. One, if resources are scarce and there's a hotspot of suitable habitat per se, or if pheromones important for communicating so that females can actually mate are hard to detect. If everybody groups together, everybody has a good chance of actually getting a mate and reproducing. When we have bees, there are a lot of bees that have evolved to be kleptoparasitic. So a lot of these hymenopterans that are solitary will provision a nest. They'll find a cavity, a habitat, an area to place their egg with some food for that larva to develop. And you see this with a lot of groups, where the female will collect a bunch of material, stuff it somewhere, lay an egg on it, and abandon ship. Now, there are some species that are lazy and don't want to collect this material for themselves, so they watch females as they build their nest, and then they come in and they lay an egg in the nest of the other species. Sometimes they will sting the egg of the female that worked hard to build that nest, and then they'll lay their egg. And sometimes they will produce an egg that will hatch quicker and then basically crush or puncture the egg or hatchling of the other species that it's parasitizing, so that it can use the food resource meant for the original species. So if you're communal, you have a little bit more protection against that, because these parasitic species are a little bit neurotic. They don't want to approach a nest where there is an active female. They want to be sneaky about it. So if you have a nest type where there are maybe 1 or 2 holes in the ground, and then underground you have 40 nests from 40 different females, the chances that all 40 females are going to be away from the nest at the same time are slim to none. So parasitic species have a harder time hitting the nest of anybody. So even if you're not home, somebody else being home kind of prevents an intruder from coming in and messing with whoever they come across first. Then we have primitive sociality. Primitive sociality is on the verge of being eusocial, but if you're primitively social, you don't have all 3 characteristics of eusociality. Eusociality has to have 3 conditions met. 1, there's cooperative brood care, wherein basically baby raising is everyone's responsibility. 2, there's reproductive division of labor, where you have the role of making all the babies being taken on by 1 or just a few individuals, and then other roles of maintaining the well-being of the colony, such as getting food and tending to the young and making sure everything is okay, will be handled by other individuals who are not reproducing, either because they're sterile or in some cases because they're in a state of reproductive diapause. A lot of bees in the Halictidae especially will have a setup where a female overwinters after mating, and then she'll produce a nest where she lays a whole bunch of eggs, and for that year, all of her offspring stick with her. She produces only female offspring at the beginning of the year. As the season draws to a close, however, her daughters will head off. She'll produce male offspring before she dies. The males will go and mate with the females and then die. And the females that spent their entire first year of life tending to the nest that they were born in hide in the soil, and the following spring they start their own nests. There's also overlap of generations with eusociality, so you have all different life cycle stages at the same time. Primitive sociality lacks one of these characteristics. Usually they lack division of labor or overlap of generations. However, you can also have primitive sociality where cooperative brood care doesn't occur. This is incredibly rare, but it can happen. So within our apocrita, we have two further subdivisions. The parasitica, which we're not going to worry about too much, just know that most wasps are part of this group called the parasitica. It includes ichneummonid wasps, it includes broconid wasps, a lot of species that deposit an egg inside of a living host. So they go around and they lay an egg on or in something, and the larva will feed on it and develop. Then we have Aculeata. Aculeata is the group of hymenopterans where the ovipositor, or egg-laying tube, is modified into a stinger so that venom can be delivered. Now, we're only worrying about Aculeata because this is the only group of the hymenopterans where eusociality is seen. So, basically, for the ant caste system, or the caste system in general, to be a thing, you have to have eusociality. And for eusociality, you have to be in the Aculeata. So, when we think about evolution, you don't have to be eusocial in order to survive. In fact, the majority of hymenopterans are not eusocial at all. They're solitary or maybe communal, whereas only a small portion have eusociality. Now, not all these guys are eusocial. So, within our Aculeata, we have numerous subfamilies. We're worrying mostly about Vespoidia and Apoidia, but we have the ants, we have wasps like yellow jackets, potter wasps, paper wasps. We have a couple of bee families. All 7 bee families are in the Apoidia. The Apoidia diverged from the Sphesoidea, which is a more basal group of Aculeata. The Sphesoidea contains your sphesid wasps and your crebronid wasps. Sphesid wasps are the wasps that, if anybody ever pulls out their window screen and there's grass and dead katydids and grasshoppers stuffed in that gap, that's a sphesid wasp. Sphesid wasps go out and they hunt for insects that they paralyze. They throw in a nest and lay an egg on them. By the way, pompilids, which are spider wasps, and a few other groups do this as well. It's not just the sphesids that have this life cycle strategy, but they're the classic example. But tarantula hawk wasps, for example, are pompilids. Anyway, within the Vespoidia and technically the Formisoidea, which contains the Formicidae, we have groups that are eusocial. Everybody's seen hornet nests, which are in the Vespidae. We have Apidae, which contains the honeybees, which we're going to get into later on.
Modification over time of these two castes led to the differentiation of still more castes, like the soldier ants. It has been proposed that this differentiation is a function of size. An ant that is larger will have more queen-like traits, and an ant that is smaller will have less. So the smaller ants that did the jobs that are better for...
Not exactly. Technically, when we think about whether an ant is destined to be a queen or a worker, this is determined fairly early on in development. Usually, the queen will feed or have her workers feed some of the larvae a particular diet that will make them grow bigger, or that will lack hormones to suppress development of ovaries and things like that, so that they do become reproductive. Most ant species have what's called a nuptial flight, wherein for several weeks prior to the event, the ants produce a whole bunch of alates or reproductives. The larvae that hatch are fed in a way that causes them to grow and form wings in the pupal stage, and then they will emerge out, they will leave the nest, they will fly around, mate with each other. The males, which are called drones, then die, and after their epic orgy, the new fertilized queens will crawl off, dig themselves in the ground, and try and form a new colony. This is the way that ant colonies reproduce themselves. It's an important thing because queen ants don't live forever, so the colony won't live forever. There's a very low success rate of new queens, unfortunately. Most of them will be eaten by something else, usually workers of a different species ant colony, or they will simply fail to find a suitable spot to produce a nest. It's actually not a trivial matter for ants to produce a new colony. The mated queen has to find a spot to nest, eat her wings, then she has to lay a few eggs. She becomes too heavy to really do too much for herself. So she has to seclude herself, produce enough workers so that she can be tended to and food can be brought, which will then allow her to produce more eggs and then have more workers, and over time she doesn't have to move around as much, and it's all on the workers to do the tasks for her. It's a very low success rate process, but it happens at least once or twice a year for most species, where a colony will send out reproductive workers in their nuptial flight. For the queen and drone castes, if you will, the drones form when an egg is not fertilized. The queens form generally when a particular diet is fed to the developing larvae. Same thing with the other castes, such as soldier or things like that. The diet that is fed to the larva is generally the cause of that particular caste. Sometimes where you have a few castes and a relatively even distribution of castes, you have just genetic predeterminants of what that larva will turn into. It really depends on the species, but again, there are not a lot of ant species that have these different caste systems. In most ants, the workers are all physically identical, and when work needs to be done, everybody kind of chips in and does their part, and what gets done is based on what needs to get done. And so an ant is going to go where it's needed generally.
For small ants to do were more successful and differentiated into a worker caste, and the larger ones that weren't quite big enough to be a queen themselves became the soldier caste. Some ants have lost different castes, and others have developed similar castes, but independently, in a spectacular example of convergent and divergent evolution. And just a minor note, when measuring ant size, we're talking about their size in the pupal stage. It mostly correlates to their adult size, but not always. It is also worth noting that ant castes are not exactly perfectly differentiated categories, but rather a spectrum, with some ants being kind of in between categories. Almost as if they are all just ants of the same species and just do the jobs they are most suited for based on their individual characteristics.
This is exactly the point that I was glad that you went into. The earlier part of this conversation got me a little bit worried that there was an implication that these different castes were totally different species. They aren't. The actual way of selection occurring here is on the part of the queen, because she's the only reproductive unit here. Queens who produce nests that produce these different castes have a better chance of her colony getting to the point where a nuptial flight is possible, because for a nuptial flight to occur, generally you have to have the colony be a critical size where they can energetically afford to let some of those worker ants turn into, larval ants turn into alates and reproductives and leave the nest and do all that. If the colony is too small, or if it's weakened because of poor work by the workers and there's not enough resource material to go around, you can't have a nuptial flight. So selection really favors the queens who make a nest that is structured in a way that allows for a nuptial flight to occur, because that is the only way for her genes to get onto the next generation. So when you have caste systems being selected for, it's because the colony itself has that capacity and that gives them a reproductive edge.
Also, individual ants transition between castes as they grow, so it looks as though they're...
I don't want to be too pedantic here, but when you say grow, you do realize that once an insect is fully mature, it doesn't really grow anymore. In fact, cell repair and division only occurs in immature stages because of something called juvenile hormone. Juvenile hormone is essential for insects to actually reach maturity. However, when juvenile hormone drops below a certain threshold, which allows maturity, it prevents juvenility, which includes the development of cells and things like that. This is why adult insects senesce and age and then die. If anybody's ever had a pet insect, they don't regenerate body parts when they're adults. So as they get older and their legs start to snap off, they can't do anything about it, and they age. Their cells are not constantly replacing themselves. So by saying that the ants are growing, you're not intentionally, but you are being slightly off the mark, because all of the growing has occurred by now. The larva is really the only stage that grows in terms of adding new cells and new organic material and becoming physically larger. I know you're going to show the honeypot ants. That's not actually new ant material. That's just the abdomen stretching to accommodate external material, and we're going to get into that in just a sec.
Their caste system is almost entirely based on size.
They must have evolved together at the very same time.
Yep. Evolution does not focus on one specific trait, develop it until it's finished, whatever that can mean, and then start work on the next one. The whole suite of traits develops simultaneously.
The crocodile that doesn't devour the plover birds which...
Alright, so polyethism is basically going from one task to another as you get older. This is especially prevalent in honeybees. Honeybees are a classic eusocial insect in the Apidae, which is a bee family. So the adults, once they emerge, live 6 to 7 weeks, and when they're very young, they take on internal tasks. And the reason for this is because if they go outside when they are very young, there's a chance they're not going to come back. The landscape is loaded with predators, mantises and spiders and birds and things. You don't want to send out all of your workers the moment they're born into this vast unknown. It's kind of a game theory type of thing. So at first, they do some internal work. They're going to start cleaning inside, and when they're a few days older, they will start transitioning to caring for larvae. They'll start by caring for the older, less delicate larvae, and as they age and get more experienced, if you will, they'll start taking care of the younger larvae. Then they start to move towards the nest edge, where they're going out and pulling in food from the foragers that are coming back and helping to move things around the inside of the hive. And then as they start to get old, so once they're 3 weeks and older, then they go do the high-risk stuff, like, flying around outside, because it's less of a loss to the colony if, your senior citizen bee dies on the job when, you may have had that bee alive for a few more days if they didn't die, than if you had a very young bee go out. Likewise, the honeypot ants, which are a desert species, a group of desert species of ants that go out, they collect sugary material, and some workers hang from the ceilings in certain chambers, storing sugars in their abdomen. They're called honeypot ants because of this. And during harsh conditions, this becomes a food source for the entire colony. Now, usually the older ants are responsible for this because they have better things to do when they're younger. Tasks such as, moving things around and helping out with larval care and collecting food is probably better done when you're fresh out of your pupa and you haven't worn down your mandibles or your muscles or gone through, wear and tear, senescence, stuff like that. And so if you want anybody in your group to waste away hanging from the ceiling half dead full of sugary food, you probably want your oldest workers doing that. So yes, in a sense, it's a different caste, but let's be clear, there aren't specific morphological changes that are occurring, because all of the morphological changes have already occurred. These are insects where, once they take on this final form, because they have the rigid exoskeleton and the lack of juvenile hormone, there can't be any further morphological changes. There can be physiological, metabolic, and hormonal changes, but not morphological changes. And if we just base caste system on morphology, we lose sight of the fact that they aren't changing their shape necessarily. I mean, this is certainly a different shape and size than this, but this can still do this. This guy just hasn't inflated and had these segments stretch, but he still has that capacity. Well, she, technically, these are all females, which brings me to my last point. One of the selection pressure, well, one of the forces that allow for selection of some of these use sociality, would be the sex determination mode in Hymenoptera, where males are haploid and females are diploid, because selection favors individuals who go and protect as much of their genetic material as they can, which means protecting your closest relatives. And because all of the ants get the same genetic material from their father, and then they get half of their mother's genetic material, they are more closely related to one another than they are to their own mother. So there is an impetus on them to help their siblings because they all have their father's DNA in common. Yeah, 100% of their father's DNA is in them, and then 50% of their mother's DNA is in them. And so even if these two ants differ in the half of their mother's DNA they got from their mother, they have that shared paternal DNA. So I hope this was a little bit insightful. This wasn't really meant to criticize anybody. This is kind of just meant to add a little bit of extra detail to a great video. Thank you.